Hello and welcome to the Good Food Institute's webinar on plant-based meat, seafood, eggs, dairy, and ingredients. My name is Daniel Gertner, and I'm the lead economic and industry analyst here at GFI. Today, my colleagues and I will cover the evolving plant-based protein industry. We'll give an overview of the commercial landscape, investments, sales, consumer insights, scientific progress, regulatory and public investment updates, and industry outlook as of 2024. For those of you not yet familiar with the Good Food Institute, we are a nonprofit think tank working to build a sustainable, secure, and just food system by advancing alternative proteins. To do this, we work across the areas of corporate engagement, science and technology, and policy. We are funded entirely by philanthropy, so if you find the insights and resources we provide useful, please consider donating. At GFI, we focus on feeding a growing population sustainably, efficiently, and safely. Demand for meat contributes to pressing global challenges like climate change, antibiotic resistance, pandemic risk, loss of biodiversity, and hunger and malnutrition. Alternative proteins offer a globally scalable solution that can address these challenges while helping satisfy the growing global demand for meat. We map out the most neglected areas that will allow alternative proteins to compete on taste, price, and nutrition. And we meet these challenges by funding open access research, developing resources, and educating and connecting the next generation of scientists and entrepreneurs working on food system sustainability. This webinar is an overview of GFI's annual State of the Industry report on plant-based foods. We also published State of the Industry reports for the cultivated and fermentation sectors, along with a report on the state of global policy. Webinars are available for each of those reports. This year, we also released a State of Alternative Proteins report, which shares stories about the people and places advancing plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation-enabled proteins. All these reports can be downloaded for free by going to this link. I'd like to thank the many GFI team members who contributed to this project, as well as external partners who supported with data and fact-checking. If you'd like to help us make our reports, webinars, and other open access resources as accurate as possible, please tell us about your company by going to GFI's company database, which is accessible on our website, and respond to surveys when we send them out. Signing up for our monthly industry newsletter is the best way to stay updated on our research, which you can also do through our website. Today's presentation is focused on plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy products, which seek to replicate the sensory experiences of animal products and can be made with a wide array of ingredients and processes. The plant-based industry has seen significant growth in the last decade plus as products have increasingly approached the taste and texture of conventional meat, bringing a new population of meat-eating consumers to the market. Globally, 2024 was marked by significant protein innovation amid both successes and struggles. This was especially true for the plant-based sector. Scientific progress in 2024 included a growing ingredient supply chain, new facilities focused on processing legumes and pulses, and a surge in plant-based research publications. We also saw regulatory milestones for plant-based foods across the globe, including new FDA labeling guidance in the US, valuable legal precedents for plant-based milk in Chile, and additional notable developments in the EU and Brazil. And public investments in alternative proteins reached a new high, with governments worldwide announcing approximately $510 million in new commitments. Finally, thanks to new product launches, consumers were introduced to more choices on supermarket shelves, including plant-based whole-cut steaks and chicken breasts. Global retail sales of plant-based meat, seafood, milk, yogurt, ice cream, and cheese grew 5% year over year to reach $28.6 billion, according to Euromonitor. In the US, the plant-based food retail market totaled $8.1 billion, more than double what it was just 7 years ago, but representing a slight decline from a high of $8.5 billion in 2022. If we want to satisfy the growing demand for meat, more progress is needed and at a quicker pace. The plant-based sector needs more resources, investment, and innovation to help sustainably scale up, bring down costs, and offer consumers better products. Over the past decade, the plant-based meat, dairy, and egg industry has experienced remarkable growth. But that growth has slowed recently. Some markets are seeing declining sales, funding has tightened, and several companies have shut down or consolidated. Plus, according to consumer research, many products on the market do not yet meet consumers' taste and/or price expectations. Similarly, more work is needed for companies to reach consumers effectively on the benefits of plant-based products like nutrition and sustainability. Still, a huge potential market remains. GFI's 2024 research found that 71% of US consumers aged 18 to 59 are open to eating plant-based meat or dairy, and 82% believe more people will do so in the future. With this backdrop, progress occurred across several fronts in 2024. Last year, we saw continued involvement in the sector from diversified food companies, new production facilities across categories, and debuts of plant-based products in formats ranging from grounds to whole-cut steaks and chicken breasts. Even amid challenges, the sector continues to evolve, diversify, and move forward. We'll cover some of the year's key developments in this section. In 2024, we saw the continued build-out of plant-based infrastructure. At least 26 new facilities were announced or opened last year, spanning conversions from conventional dairy to plant-based dairy production, novel processing facilities, and new oat milk manufacturing plants. At least 5 plant-based technology centers or innovation hubs were also opened or announced in 2024, 3 in the US and 2 in Europe. These hubs help companies de-risk scale-up, validate commercial viability, and reduce costs. And finally, at least 5 ingredient processing and 4 plant-based meat facilities opened or were announced in 2024, all of which were located outside the United States. These developments demonstrate that the global plant-based ecosystem continues to grow, even as the US market faces some uncertainty. Many of the world's largest meat, consumer packaged goods, and ingredient companies remain active in the plant-based industry. These companies are engaging in a variety of ways, from investments in joint ventures to product development, licensing, and production partnerships. In 2024, diversified food companies deepened their engagements in the plant-based sector. Companies including Kraft Heinz, Nestle, Lactalis, Unilever, Sigma Alimentos, and Danone introduced new products across global markets, retrofitted facilities for plant-based production, and partnered on several research and development initiatives. By leveraging their funding, infrastructure, and distribution networks, diversified companies can serve as a force multiplier for the plant-based sector. Plant-based products provide companies with additional sources of key inputs, encourage cost competition, and allow brands to reach new consumers. Integrating these products into supply chains can increase companies' resilience to market shocks, broaden risk management opportunities, and promote long-term cost stability. In 2024, the plant-based sector saw the formation of several strategic partnerships and the launch of a wide range of new products. At least 13 partnerships were formed in the plant-based sector in 2024, with especially robust activity in plant-based meat product development, production technology, and plant-based dairy. These partnerships help companies improve product quality and accessibility by leveraging shared expertise and resources, which can improve outcomes for individual companies and the industry as a whole. Startups and large CPG firms also debuted plant-based products across product types, distribution channels, and global regions in 2024. Product launch activity was highest in Europe, where sales and private investment trends remained most resilient. The dairy and beef categories experienced the most product launches and distribution gains, while products also debuted in several lesser-known formats. Multiple large plant-based meat companies refreshed their branding in 2024 to better reach consumers around key concerns, including taste and health. Beyond Meat, for example, unveiled new health-focused formulations and packaging for their plant-based beef and dinner sausage products, and Impossible Foods debuted a new brand identity featuring red packaging to appeal to meat-eating consumers. Together, these developments represent an evolving plant-based landscape, one that's adapting to reach consumers with better products and stronger value propositions. Moving to investments. Privately held companies primarily involved in plant-based meat, seafood, eggs, or dairy have raised $8.4 billion since 2006, while publicly traded companies have secured $2.5 billion. In 2024, the plant-based sector attracted $309 million in total funding, virtually all of which was raised by privately held companies, according to GFI's analysis of data from Net Zero Insights. The funding landscape for plant-based foods and alternative proteins has shifted to a more subdued environment in recent years. Elevated interest rates, uncertain scale-up timelines, and high production and materials costs have slowed the flow of capital into the alternative protein sector. Fewer companies are now raising money, and the rounds they do raise are generally smaller than they were during the low interest rate period of 2020 to 2022. The slowdown mirrors a broader decline in climate tech investments, which have also dipped each year since 2021. While total venture funding saw slight growth in 2024, That growth was almost entirely driven by investments in AI, meaning growth in AI funding was likely at the expense of other sectors. Plus, the scope of plant-based investment remains small relative to many other industries. The electric vehicle sector, for example, raised $3.3 billion globally in the first 3 quarters of 2024 alone, more than 10 times the amount the plant-based sector raised last year. Plant-based companies still expanded into unique product formats, formed new partnerships, and implemented process improvements despite limited access to funding. But to continue this momentum, they need more resources and more diverse funding strategies. To increase scale and lower costs, the sector will need to look beyond traditional venture capital and build out a more multi-pronged approach to funding, which I'll touch on in a later slide. While 2024 was marked by a tighter capital market, bright spots still emerged, and 3 deals surpassed $30 million. This tells us a few things. First, investment appetite still exists for strong, differentiated players. Second, the broader funding landscape has reset and will likely stay lower for the near term until companies can prove additional scale, cost efficiency, and market traction. And finally, despite being the most advanced of the alternative protein platforms, plant-based meat remains in its early stages. The first products aiming to provide the same sensory experience as eating conventional meat hit the market just over a decade ago. Many companies in this space still have a limited commercial footprint, and in an environment of declining sales in many regions, the tighter capital environment may mean that some manufacturers will be unable to secure funding and will downsize, close operations, or merge with other organizations. This was the case for a handful of companies in 2024, most notably in Ahimsa Company's acquisition of Wicked Kitchen, Simulate, and Blackbird Foods. But consolidation shouldn't be equated with decline. Consolidation is inevitable for any nascent sector, and it can actually accelerate progress by concentrating talent, IP, and know-how. So we'll continue to watch how these trends develop over the next year or so. So let's talk about where we go from here. Venture capital is not typically well suited to fund new facilities, and many plant-based companies still need to add capacity to increase scale and lower costs. As a result, companies looking to scale will likely need to identify alternative sources of funding. These include, but aren't limited to, equipment leasing and project finance, strategic corporate partnerships, and public sector programs and government investment. However, many of these channels remain underdeveloped for plant-based and other alternative proteins. As a result, it's more important than ever that companies, investors, governments, and philanthropists develop innovative funding solutions that support the growth of the plant-based industry. GFI also continues to conduct research, policy advocacy, investor engagement, and coalition building to create the infrastructure and incentives needed to unlock these new capital pathways and support the sector's long-term growth. Next, I'll hand it over to Jody, our Associate Director of Market Insights.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to share an overview of sales trends for plant-based foods in 2024, focusing on retail and food service sales in the US, and also touching on global sales. Starting with a snapshot of where the plant-based foods retail market stood in 2024. Overall sales were down slightly, but we saw pockets of growth and positive signs in several underlying metrics. In 2024, plant-based food sales in US retail were $8.1 billion. To put this in context, the market was twice the size it was just 7 years before. Plant-based price increases slowed. In fact, prices increased only 1% across plant-based categories in 2024, compared to a 2% increase for the total food sector. However, it's important to note that the price gap between plant-based and conventional products remained significant. Velocities, which are a measure of how fast items are turning at the shelf, improved across many plant-based categories, including plant-based meat. For example, in the natural channel, which is often on the leading edge of change in the retail sector, dollar velocity for plant-based meat increased 12%. 6 in 10 US households purchased plant-based foods in 2024, and most did so more than once. This demonstrates strong ongoing consumer engagement in the category. Plant-based brands continue to innovate to meet consumer needs, launching new products, reformulating products, and enhancing marketing. We saw early impacts of these strategies in the market in 2024 and expect them to continue to play out this year and beyond. As I mentioned, in 2024, Plant-based food sales in US retail were $8.1 billion, down 4% from 2023. For the overall food sector, dollar sales were up slightly by 2% and unit sales were flat. Among various factors impacting consumer choice at the shelf, price is an increasing challenge. Across multiple studies GFI and others conducted in 2024, we saw more consumers than ever saying that price was impacting their food choices. This is playing out across the food sector, but is particularly salient for plant-based products that are often priced much higher than conventional alternatives. Looking at individual plant-based categories, we saw varying performance in US retail in 2024 with some pockets of growth. Plant-based milk and meat did experience declining sales. On the other hand, several categories, including plant-based protein powders and liquids, tofu, tempeh, and seitan, and baked goods, all grew. Even within categories, performance was mixed. For example, several of the largest plant-based milk brands experienced strong sales growth. These dynamics reflect a market continuing to evolve and mature to meet consumer needs. Market share is an important metric to understand progress in plant-based products displacing conventional counterparts. In 2024, the largest plant-based category, plant-based milk, held a meaningful 14% share of total milk dollar sales in retail. The story is even more compelling looking at the natural channel, where plant-based milk accounted for more than a third of the total milk market. Plant-based meat had about a 1% share in overall retail and 4% in the natural channel. Many US households engaged with the plant-based category in retail in 2024. About 6 in 10 purchased plant-based foods, and almost 80% of those purchased multiple times, which was similar to the prior year. Plant-based milk had the highest penetration of any individual plant-based category, with 4 in 10 households buying in 2024, and again, most of those buying multiple times. 13% of households bought plant-based meat. This was down slightly from 15% in 2023, but repeat purchase rates were steady during that time. Other plant-based categories were purchased by a small minority of households. Given the significant and growing importance of price to consumer food choice, it's important to understand how plant-based products stack up to their conventional counterparts on price. Looking at plant-based versus animal-based product price per weight in retail, there is a significant gap across categories, with most plant-based categories priced on average about 2 to 4 times higher than conventional counterparts. We didn't see much change in these gaps in 2024. One notable exception was eggs, where the gap narrowed as the price of conventional eggs increased due to the rise in rates of avian flu. We saw early indications of this driving increased demand for plant-based eggs coming into 2025. Shifting now to US food service, where we look at broadline distributor sales to food service operators. In food service, we saw a decline in plant-based protein sales in 2024, with dollars down 5% and units down 4%. For comparison, the overall food sector in food service grew, with dollar sales to broadline distributors up 4% and pound sales up 2%. The plant-based protein category, as defined in this food service data, includes both plant-based analog products as well as plant-forward non-analogs and tofu and tempeh. Analog products made up 56% of plant-based protein pound sales in 2024, highlighting continued consumer demand for products that mimic the taste, texture, and functionality of conventional meat. Other plant-based categories gained traction in food service in 2024. Plant-based milk continued to experience strong growth, up 9% in dollar sales and outpacing conventional milk sales growth. Plant-based milk held a 12% share of total food service milk sales in 2024. We also saw growth in plant-based creamer and egg sales in food service. To put the US sales in context, global retail sales for plant-based dairy and meat were estimated to be over $28 billion in 2024. Plant-based dairy accounts for the largest portion of that at $22 billion. Plant-based meat sales were about $6 billion, and that was concentrated in Europe and the US. Sales grew globally across these plant-based categories in 2024. That was largely led by growth in Europe. Among various factors influencing this, it was likely, at least in part, fueled by some European retailers implementing sustained price cuts as part of efforts to increase their plant-based sales. Looking ahead to 2025, we see the plant-based category well positioned for continued progress and growth globally. Now I'll hand it over to Taylor, our consumer research lead.
Thanks, Jody. I'm Taylor, GFI's US Consumer Research Lead. New research in the US in 2024 helped us identify the behavioral drivers of the sales trends that we just saw, including some main reasons why people are purchasing plant-based meat and their unmet needs for it. And research from GFI's global affiliates in South and Southeast Asia, Europe, and Brazil shed light on global growth opportunities this year. So first, let's take a look at the state of consumer demand in the US. How many people have heard of plant-based meat? How many are eating it? And how many have tried it but stopped, and why? So in the US, important metrics like awareness of plant-based meat and how many people have tried it didn't change much from 2023, but the industry did cross one notable milestone. For the first time, we saw more than half of American adults say that they've tried plant-based meat in a large annual survey that we run. This also means that most of the more than two-thirds of Americans who have even heard of plant-based meat have now tried it. So on the one hand, this points to the breakthrough success that the category has seen in recent years, but on the other, it also suggests that it will be harder for the category to find new consumers going forward. And in light of the retail and food service trends that we just saw, where dollar sales decreased despite these new people trying and buying plant-based meat, it's particularly important for the industry to find ways to grow sales among its current and lapsed consumers going forward. So when we ask people how often they're eating plant-based meat, we see that while there are many who eat it frequently, there are even more who eat it only occasionally or never. Around a quarter of American adults claim to be eating plant-based meat at least once a month or more often. And while almost as many are eating it just once or a few times a year, almost half say they never eat it, and around 13% say they've tried it but stopped eating it. And that's around a quarter of the people who say they've ever tried it. So, what distinguishes people eating plant-based meat often from those eating it only occasionally or never? And what can the industry do to get more people to consider it or consider it more frequently? So first, people in the US tend to see plant-based meat as healthy, sustainable, and high protein, but not to see it as tasty or affordable. Interestingly, most people tend to agree that plant-based meat is healthy regardless of whether they're eating it, meaning that lapsed and holdout consumers of plant-based meat also see it as healthy, but just aren't choosing it based on that. Those who agree that plant-based meat is tasty are much more likely to be the ones eating it frequently, but also a minority, as we see here, which points to taste being one of the key challenges facing the category today. You can see more data on this in the full report and in our consumer snapshot reports on our website. Now, let's look at what would motivate these different groups of consumers to consider buying plant-based meat. So here we're comparing the reasons that would lead people to buy a hypothetical new plant-based meat product in the store across frequent users, people who have tried it but stopped eating it, which we call lapsed users, and holdouts who have never tried plant-based meat. And there's two main takeaways. One, taste is the top motivator for every group. People don't buy foods that they don't think taste good, so finding ways to improve products' taste and getting channels for people to try these products, whether that's samples in grocery stores like we prompted here, or other channels like restaurants, is going to be key for new products to find the right consumers going forward. And two, it will be easier for the industry to re-attract lapsed users with new products than it will be to convince people who still haven't tried these products to buy them in the future. Significant numbers of lapsed consumers say they're open to eating plant-based meat again if taste and/or cost improve, and others would be motivated by things like if it had more protein than conventional meat. There's only a small minority of lapsed consumers, 29%, who say they wouldn't repurchase it for any reason. But those who haven't tried plant-based meat yet aren't likely to be convinced by any single product-related reason we tested here. More than half say they wouldn't. So because taste is the thing most people who are open to these products say they're interested in, it's important for us to understand the gap between plant-based and conventional meat on taste. And new research in 2024 expanded our understanding of this gap. So research by the nonprofit research initiative Nectar suggests that while some plant-based meat products are performing comparably to their conventional counterparts on taste, many have room to improve. A sensory study that they ran in 2024 found that of 5 plant-based product types tested, including burgers, hot dogs, bacon, nuggets, and tenders, only plant-based nuggets performed comparably to their conventional counterparts on overall satisfaction and several key sensory metrics. They found that the top-rated plant-based brand even outperformed conventional nuggets on ratings of flavor. They also found that blended meat products that can combine plant-based and conventional meat tended to be rated higher than purely plant-based ones on taste, suggesting that blended products may be another way to appeal to these holdout consumers or ones who aren't satisfied with the taste of current options. So this probably doesn't reflect a significant recent improvement in sensory performance for products like nuggets. GFI did similar sensory research in collaboration with Givaudan and Ingredion between 2020 and 2022, and also found that several plant-based meat products at that time met or exceeded the performance on metrics like taste. So nuggets have essentially been overperforming for a while now. These results get discussed in more detail in the full report, which also links to the full Nectar research report. Their 2025 study was also just released. So while taste appears to be the big common factor and unmet consumer need for plant-based meat, many US consumers are also looking for other benefits that point to additional opportunities for the category to grow. Last year, GFI published the first public segmentation of US consumers' plant-based food needs and behaviors, which identified 6 groups of consumers who are at least somewhat open to plant-based meat and dairy, but who choose it for very different reasons, including some health-focused ones like being low-fat, low-calorie, high protein, being natural, etc., and others for non-health reasons like sustainability or animal welfare, and some, of course, taste and price. The full segmentation is available on our website, and the link is at the bottom of the screen here. Finally, we also got a lot of research from outside the US that points to growth opportunities internationally. GFI APAC conducted a consumer perception study on plant-based meat and conventional meat in Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And they found that the market for plant-based meat in these regions remains less mature than in others, but also identifies several growth opportunities, including high protein products and also blended meat, like we just discussed. They also identified cost as a top challenge for consumers in these regions. GFI India conducted in-depth research on Indian consumers' experiences with plant-based meat, including multiple weeks of surveys and in-home cooking activities, finding strong satisfaction with some product segments, but also gaps on sensory attributes, cooking experience, and of course, value. GFI Europe did consumer research in the UK and Germany in partnership with the Plant Futures Collective and HarrisX, and found that high rates of interest in flexitarian diets and meat reduction are in those regions, but also some key areas where plant-based meat isn't yet fully working to fill those gaps in people's diets. And a survey conducted by GFI Brazil also found that many Brazilians are looking to reduce their consumption of animal products, that almost 2/3 had heard of plant-based meat, but that less than a quarter had tried it, pointing to a huge growth opportunity in that region. So now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Nikki Kogar, to talk us through the state of science and technology.
Thank you, Taylor. In 2024, researchers continued to mature the plant-based meat industry by responding to consumer taste and cost demands. We'll cover some of the key advances in this section, but first take a look at the publication and patent trends across the sector. We've seen a steady rise in research on plant-based alternatives, including hybrid and blended products, starting around 2014, but things really took off after 2020. In fact, over 70% of all publications on plant-based meat came out after 2015, and more than half since 2020, showing that the field is in a state of rapid expansion. On the patent side, there's a slightly different story. After several years of strong growth, new patent filings for plant-based meat dipped in 2023 and 24. That said, the number of patents filed in the last few years is still among the highest to date. This recent drop could be due to a combination of things, like global funding cuts for alternative proteins and the typical 18 months delay between filing and publication. But it's also part of a bigger pattern. The trend we're seeing in plant-based meat patents actually mirrors what's happening across the broader food and ag sectors. Both saw big growth followed by a recent slowdown, likely driven by shifting investor priorities and some economic headwinds. Next, we'll cover some key advances across the value chain, starting with innovation in plant protein ingredients, which focus on removing off flavors and off colors without sacrificing protein yield, quality, or functionality. Pea protein is still a major player, and manufacturers like Roquette released new options for plant-based meat producers, including products with enhanced gel and emulsification strength and 30% lower sodium. Faba bean is also gaining attention for its neutral flavor, color, and high protein content, with several companies releasing new faba bean protein isolates. Beyond peas and faba beans, we're seeing exciting development in sidestream and emerging sources like canola, sunflower, and rubisco from saltbush and duckweed. To produce these proteins more sustainably, companies are advancing technologies that avoid solvent use and spray drying, such as dry fractionation and hydrothermal treatment, which can also make plant minerals more bioavailable. Finally, other emerging processing methods like ultrasound and enzyme treatments are helping address common challenges with plant proteins. For example, ultrasonic processing can remove bitter compounds and pigments, while enzymatic treatments can reduce viscosity, making pea protein concentrates behave more like isolates. Researchers are also optimizing plant protein texturization to deliver better products by forming smaller plant protein fibers and enhancing the scale of emerging techniques. This table highlights the reported throughput, so the amount of final product produced per hour, across a range of texturization technologies used to make plant-based meats. Automated continuous processing by Rebellious Foods leads with 2,200 kilograms per hour. Clextrol is also making big strides. They announced 1,200 kilograms per hour with traditional high moisture extrusion last year. This year, they released a first-of-its-kind combination of extrusion with shear cell technology to create larger, softer, more fibrous textures and achieve production of wider hole cuts, which drops to about 400 kilograms per hour due to increased complexity. Other companies like Rival and Caucus improved the scalability of emerging texturization technologies, such as shear cell and 3D printing. Overall, there's a trade-off between throughput and textural complexity, but the field is evolving quickly with innovation aimed at balancing scale, cost, and product quality. Researchers are focused on improving microstructure properties, incorporating fat, optimizing scalability, and ensuring consistency, especially for ingredients besides soy and wheat. On the health and nutrition front, randomized controlled trials provide the most robust evidence on the causal relationship between dietary interventions and health outcomes. The individual trials published this year were positive or neutral on the effects of plant-based meat compared to animal-based meat. However, one of the biggest milestones this year was the publication of 2 major systematic reviews, including the first ever meta-analysis on plant-based meat and cardiometabolic health. These studies pulled together all the clinical trials to date from almost 370 participants in total and found consistent improvements when plant-based meat was consumed in place of animal meat, including a drop in LDL or bad cholesterol and body weight. The drop in LDL was not just statistically significant, but also clinically meaningful, which is particularly promising. And interestingly, concerns about sodium or processing didn't show any evidence of canceling out those heart health benefits. Now that we've reached the minimum number of trials needed for a strong synthesis, this is a turning point, but it's also a beginning. We need more research to keep building the case and to help make these products even healthier moving forward. Beyond health, the environmental advantages of alternative proteins are gaining even stronger evidence. This year, the World Bank released a landmark global roadmap for tackling climate change through the agri-food system. Alternative proteins rank second only to reforestation for their climate mitigation potential, outperforming things like reducing food waste and livestock methane. That's largely because they require far less land, which also makes space for reforestation and nature restoration. The report calls for a massive scale-up in investments to the agri-food system, specifically 18-fold growth to half emissions by 2030, but the return could be huge, a 16-to-1 payoff in economic, health, and environmental benefits. And to back this up with hard data, GFI's life cycle and land use studies show that plant-based meat offers 89% lower environmental impact than animal meat and could unlock significant biodiversity gains in the US and Europe. Finally, this year we saw exciting growth in the scientific ecosystem supporting alternative proteins with new tools and collaborations that help connect the dots across a historically fragmented field. First, 2 new ecosystem directories launched. Altmeat's inaugural supplier directory, which maps everything from ingredients to equipment to packaging, and GFI's interactive global map, which highlights companies, researchers, and student groups across the world. Second, GFI APAC released an interactive alternative protein career pathways tool that's great for students and professionals alike. It breaks down the skills needed for jobs across the alt protein value chain, helping people find their place in this developing field. And third, there's been major momentum in research center development, most notably the $90 million investment from the Bezos Earth Fund. That funding was awarded to establish Bezos Centers for Sustainable Protein at North Carolina State University, Imperial College London, and the National University of Singapore to drive cross-disciplinary collaboration and commercialization. Together, these tools and institutions are making the plant-based field more connected, visible, and accessible than ever before. And with that, I'll hand off to Michael, our policy specialist in diplomacy.
Thank you, Nikki. I'm Michael Carter, policy specialist in diplomacy here at GFI. Overall, public investment in plant-based alternative proteins experienced a modest decline in 2024. Though still receiving a steady level of government investment over the past year, including exciting developments in Europe and Asia, plant-based proteins will require a higher degree of support to meet key consumer benchmarks and achieve policymakers' food security, resource management, and economic development goals. 2024 saw continued support from plant-based proteins' biggest national proponents. Denmark and Canada competed for global leadership in plant-based protein development and commercialization, with Denmark increasing the budget for its plant fund and Canada continuing to offer transformative grants through the Protein Industries Canada Public-Private Partnership. The European Union, Sweden, and Australia all provided public investments towards new production facilities as well, which will support local crop producers by creating new markets for their products and provide diversified domestic sources of protein for consumers. Research and development is also crucial for building consumer demand and improving production processes, and governments helped advance the science of plant-based proteins through new innovation centers in the United States, Spain, and South Korea, and a new research program in Singapore to improve the taste and price of plant-based and fermented proteins. This public investment is the result of policymakers recognizing that plant-based products are a promising intervention in the face of supply chain disruptions and an opportunity to create new markets for domestic crops. Overall, the slight decline in public investment in 2024 does not seem to be indicative of a broader trend, but comes on the heels of a larger multi-year investments from the world's leaders in plant-based proteins. Still, more public investment is needed for plant-based proteins to reach consumers, meet their needs, and deliver on the food security, health, and resource management potential these foods offer. I'll now pass it to Mackenzie Battle, our regulatory attorney.
Thanks, Michael. In 2024, labeling regulations continued to impact how plant-based proteins can be marketed and sold. It is not uncommon for plant-based meat and dairy companies to face censorship from local and national regulators. However, some of these policies have been successfully challenged in court, and governments are working on labeling legislation that does not put plant-based proteins at a competitive disadvantage compared to conventional proteins. In Brazil, in September of 2024, the Ministry of Agriculture held a public hearing on regulating plant-based products. This led to a draft framework outlining identity, quality, labeling, and registration standards for plant-based products. The final regulation is expected to be developed jointly by Brazil's Health Regulatory Agency, Anvisa, as well as the Ministry of Agriculture. In Chile, the Chilean Court of Appeals of Valdivia dismissed a lawsuit from an association of milk producers that aimed to block plant-based company Notco from using the term milk on plant-based beverages. The court ruled that Notco's labeling clearly indicates that the product is not cow's milk and is unlikely to mislead consumers. This decision sets an important precedent for the labeling of plant-based products in Chile. In China, in November 2024, the Chinese Institute of Food Science and Technology issued a draft industry standard on general principles for plant-based foods. Once finalized, this will be the first industry standard in China designed specifically for plant-based products. And in the European Union, while plant-based products enjoy consumer support across the EU, current regulations prohibit the use of terms like milk, cheese, and butter on plant-based dairy alternatives. Manufacturers may instead use phrases such as alternative to milk or plant-based yogurt alternative. In 2024, some EU member states moved to impose even stricter labeling restrictions on these products. In Austria, the administrative court dismissed a lawsuit against Revo Foods, a local food tech startup specializing in 3D printed plant-based seafood. The case alleged that the product named Revo Salmon 100% plant-based with pea protein could mislead consumers into believing that the product was conventional salmon. The court ruled in favor of Revo Foods, ultimately concluding that the product's label was clear and not deceptive to consumers. In France, the government issued a decree aiming to ban the use of terms like steak, cutlet, and butcher in the marketing of plant-based products. But in October 2024, the European Court of Justice overturned that decree, ruling that such terms cannot be prohibited under EU law unless they have legally protected definitions at the national level. In response, the French government officially annulled the decree in January 2025. And unrelated to labeling, in November 2024, the European Food Safety Authority found Impossible Foods soy-like hemoglobin, made via precision fermentation, to be safe for consumption. Known for giving plant-based meat its bleeding effect, the ingredient now awaits final approval from the European Commission and EU member states. In December 2024, the UK Court of Appeal ruled against Oatly after a 4-year legal dispute with Dairy UK Limited, and banned the use of the word milk in Oatly's post-milk generation slogan on packaging. The court found it violated British trademark law and EU regulations, which reserve the word milk for animal-derived products. Unless appealed to the UK Supreme Court, this ruling will stand and may affect labeling and marketing of other plant-based dairy alternatives. In the United States, in January of this year, 2025, the Food and Drug Administration issued draft guidance on labeling plant-based alternatives to meat, seafood, eggs, and dairy. It didn't address milk, which was addressed by the Food and Drug Administration in 2023. The guidance allows the use of animal-derived terms as long as they are not misleading, but it encourages naming products by their main plant sources. So, for example, the guidance would request that an eggless scramble be called a chia seed and flaxseed eggless scramble instead of just a plant-based scramble. Although this is non-binding, the draft guidance reflects FDA's regulatory stance on this labeling matter, and public comments on the guidance closed in May 2025, with no final rule yet issued. At the state level, in recent years, several U.S. states have proposed or enacted laws restricting meat and dairy terms on plant-based labels. GFI tracks these bills and challenges unfair labeling laws. In 2024, 3 states saw litigation updates, so starting with Missouri. In 2018, GFI sued Missouri on behalf of Tofurky, arguing that Missouri's plant-based labeling law violates free speech. In March 2024, a federal court ruled that the law only bans inherently misleading labels and affirmed that qualified terms such as plant-based or veggie do not confuse consumers. In Oklahoma, in 2023, the Animal Legal Defense Fund and Plant-Based Foods Association challenged Oklahoma's label censorship law, arguing that it was vague, burdensome, unconstitutional, and preempted by federal law. In June 2024, the case was dismissed for lack of standing, as PBFA had not been able to show concrete harm. The ruling aligned with a recent Supreme Court decision that had found that using organizational resources alone is not enough for an organization to prove an injury, which is necessary to establish standing. And finally, in Texas, GFI and the Animal Legal Defense Fund challenged a Texas label censorship law in 2023. And in September 2024, the U.S. District Court of the Western District of Texas rejected the state's attempt to dismiss this lawsuit. Litigation remains ongoing at this time. And with that, I'll pass it back to Daniel to close us out.
Thanks, Mackenzie. The plant-based sector has achieved significant progress over the past decade, but the industry remains in its early stages. Plant-based meat, dairy, and egg products represent only a tiny fraction of the global market, and sales and investment and consumer adoption headwinds have slowed the industry's growth in recent years. Despite these headwinds, in 2024, companies from startups to large CPGs launched plant-based products ranging from ribeye to caviar, opened facilities across the value chain, and established product development and distribution partnerships. Some European retailers boosted plant-based protein sales by implementing sustained price cuts as part of dedicated efforts to diversify protein supplies and increase plant-based sales. Multiple alternative protein innovation hubs and centers of excellence opened, enhancing opportunities for future innovation and collaboration, and plant-based sensory study results demonstrated that matching and even surpassing the taste of conventional meat is achievable for at least some plant-based products. These developments pushed the sector forward in 2024 and laid the groundwork for future progress. So what does that mean for the year ahead? Global retail sales for plant-based meat, seafood, milk, yogurt, ice cream, and cheese continued to grow in 2024, but select regions, including the US, have experienced consecutive years of plant-based meat sales declines. To reach more consumers, plant-based foods need to compete with other food products across several metrics. The products that consumers perceive as good value due to a combination of taste, price, nutrition, and other benefits will have the best chance to succeed in the marketplace. Products that fall short of consumer expectations may continue to struggle. Ongoing supply and disease pressures in the global egg and US beef and dairy markets could present an opportunity for plant-based protein brands to reintroduce their products to consumers or partner with companies looking to diversify their supply chains. If these efforts are successful, they could boost sales for individual manufacturers. But financing remains a constraint. Venture capital is unlikely to cover the industry's full scale-up needs. Companies will need to adopt creative, multi-pronged strategies, supplementing private capital with public and philanthropic support. As companies learn to navigate this new financing landscape, those unable to access funding will likely downsize, consolidate with other companies, or close. As with any sector charting new paths in uncertain environments, it will take time to identify the most viable financing approaches, so some industry consolidation is likely to occur this year. Despite potential consolidation, plant-based meat brands will continue to refine existing products in response to consumer needs, while also expanding into new formats and occasions in 2025. This will allow retailers to further optimize their assortments while offering consumers access to new, innovative products. Zooming out, the plant-based industry still has a long road to parity with conventional meat when it comes to price, taste, and convenience. Companies need to increase scale, lower costs, and communicate the value of their products and production methods to consumers. Progress occurred on all these fronts in 2024. As plant-based companies continue to navigate this landscape, an immense opportunity remains. Household penetration for plant-based protein products generally remains low, and market shares are in the single digits across a handful of categories in the US and Europe. Yet consumers remain open to plant-based products if they can meet expectations around key metrics like taste, price, accessibility, and health, presenting a sizable opportunity for growth. In the meantime, global meat demand is expected to rise by over 50% from 2012 levels by 2050, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Multiple strategies will be needed to meet this growing global demand for meat while staying within planetary bounds, and plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy can be part of the solution. But to get there, we need a major ramp up in investment, regulatory support, and infrastructure development. Given sufficient funding and regulatory support, plant-based foods have the potential to provide consumers with the products they love while increasing food security, promoting biodiversity, and protecting public and planetary health. So thank you for tuning in to our presentation on plant-based meat, seafood, eggs, dairy, and ingredients. We're optimistic about the future of plant-based proteins as agricultural innovations addressing the root causes of many of the challenges our food supply faces today. As we close, I want to highlight 3 reasons for optimism. First, scientific and product innovation continues to rapidly advance. Research and development is driving advancements across the plant-based ecosystem, from whole-cut plant-based meats to improved ingredients and production processes. Second, infrastructure and industry collaboration also continue to advance. In 2024, at least 26 facilities opened or were announced, as were 5 innovation hubs. Plus, over a dozen strategic partnerships were formed, many involving major multinational food companies. These advancements lay critical groundwork for broader consumer access and supply chain resilience. Third, consumers deserve better food choices and the freedom to make them. Plant-based proteins can offer meat eaters a delicious, affordable way to diversify their diets while achieving health and nutrition gains and a lighter environmental footprint. Bringing these proteins to market gives consumers greater choice, enabling them to enjoy their favorite foods made in increasingly sustainable ways. The path ahead will require sustained innovation, investment, and policy alignment. But with the progress achieved so far, we have a strong foundation to build on, and a compelling case for plant-based products as solutions to meeting the growing demand for protein. As a reminder, there are 2 more webinars in this series focused on the fermentation and cultivated meat sectors, and 1 more focused on global policy. We invite you to watch each of those webinars and dive into our report series. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.